Hi, everyone. I'm BJ. I'm the genealogy specialist at the Maine State Library. And tonight I am going to do part two of my talk on tracing your Scottish ancestry. If you haven't seen part one, it's up at YouTube and you'll be able to understand this, but I think you'll want to also watch part one. So let me bring up my PowerPoint. And the things that go away when I do that, but that I still need to see. Hi, and so do you guys have my screen? Good. Something's working today. So, okay, so let's look at, I want to start, I know I briefly touched on church records last week, but I want to do a few more samples just so you can see, because I know several of you are interested in the earlier records. So I want you to see the sorts of things that are available up through the mid 19th century. So that you can see that it's not just a complete void. It's hit or miss, like church records will be. After church records before you get civil registration, but I think that there are some records that you will find for Scotland that will be very helpful. So I showed you this last week, the Kirk session records, and essentially what this is the Kirk session is sort of both the administrative representative group of a congregation and the disciplinary part. And in the years that we're looking at for church records, it was very much the disciplinary part. And as you can see, these are two single people guilty of unsuitable behavior with each other. So we'll see some others like that, of what they did, but they kept other records as well. So this is an interesting one. This is the Scotland's People Search for my couple great grandparents that are part of this talk. Robert Jameson, Janet Hislop. One thing to notice here is there are two of them with a day apart in two different parishes. This one is in Dalkeith and this one is in Leith South, which are, I don't know, 15 miles apart maybe. And I have both of them, and they are the same couple, because what would happen is they would have to have the banns, which was the announcement of the marriage, coming with time for people to object in both his parish and her parish. So this is the record I showed you last week from South Leith, which is where Robert lived. And this is from Dalkeith. Now, in this case, the information is essentially the same. There's a little less in the Dalkeith one because it doesn't have the witnesses, whereas this one does have the two official witnesses to the marriage. But what's interesting about theirs is there's also an entry in the Leith Kirk session records about them getting married. Exactly the same as what was in the parish register, but you don't find this for everything. The two you'll often find. And I have found times when there are witnesses in one or not the other, or a residence name or an occupation in one and not the other. So it is worth buying both certificates in a case like this. Sometimes one will just list the dates the banns were read at a church service, but the other one will actually say the marriage happened, whereas the first one doesn't. So that's the sort, yes, there are places where There are gaps in the records, but there are also times where the system throws up two or three copies of something. This is an interesting one. It's a baptism from Dalkeith, actually. And it says Susanna, lawful daughter of John Ritchie and Margaret Wilson, blah, blah, blah. The child's aunt was the sponsor. And it says, this child, when some weeks old, was baptized by the English parson, meaning the Episcopalian Anglican at Montrose. But as he pronounced the baptismal words, not when he sprinkled the water on the child, but only afterwards when he was wringing his fingers with a towel, Bishop Cameron ordered me to baptize the child sub conditione. And so I've run into this in Quebec Catholic records as well, where it's not clear if a baptism happened or that it was done properly by the view of the person that is either going to marry a couple, or in this case, the new church. And so they do it again with the idea that it's conditional and effective if the first one hadn't been right. But if the first one was okay, theologically, spiritually, whatever, it was just done for extra assurance. So, but again, this is a case where you might have found this in the Anglican records for the area, and you didn't have a sponsor name. Or maybe it's not in the Anglican records, but this gives you an idea that I'm guessing, but yeah, it says right here, she was born in 1814 and then rebaptized in 1822. So you do want to, and this is true with most records, but especially with baptismal records. I think I know I've showed you examples from here in New England where you get, 3 or 4 kids in a family baptized at the same time. So obviously some of them are not, 3 days old. So that's something to be aware of, that if you're working from a birth date or a baptismal date, you may want to be a little flexible about the relationship between the two. So let's take a look. This is one, Scotland's People tweeted this one out the other day. Something George something, lawful fun to what you call him, in Mains of Barksimming was baptized. How's that for a helpful? So something George something, lawful son to what you call him. So that's not very helpful, actually. This is an interesting one. I think I mentioned last week that Scotland allowed what were called irregular marriages, where you just had to stand up in front of witnesses and declare you were married. Needless to say, that the Presbyterian Church, the Church of Scotland, was not that.
We do hope to talk with you in the near future.
Was not incredibly happy about these. They lost revenue. They lost control of things. And so often if a couple was married irregularly, as this was called, if they wanted to go back to having communion at the church, they had to go to the Kirk session and have their marriage approved. So this is one, David Thompson and Allison Ross, guilty of an irregular marriage, came before the session and gave the following lines bearing that they were married at Edinburgh on the 28th of March, 1806, by one who signs himself John Wilson, minister. They were rebuked by the moderator of the Kirk session for their irregular conduct and exhorted to live as becometh. In other words, to be good church members and live the way they're supposed to. So again, this is the sort of thing that there's probably not another record of this marriage, but it's in the Kirk session records because of that. Here's one, Marianne, daughter of Francis Shales, or said to be so. And I think it's Debbie Nicol, 10 weeks old, was baptized by me. So This is a case where the parents weren't married, and it sounds like they're not convinced that Francis was the father. Here's one. Magdalene Dryden acknowledged that she had lately brought forth a child in uncleanness, and being interrogated, declared that Thomas Rutherford, occupation mason in Hoyk, was the father of her child. And this is a case where, because they didn't live in the same parish, the Kirk session appointed their clerk to send an extract of this minute to the Kirk session at Hoyk. So this is at Cavers. Hoyk is the next parish over. And sometimes this can help you figure out, where somebody was from. This is a case in Selkirk, also in southern Scotland, that Helen Ballantyne, who made confession of the sin of fornication and admitted her being the mother of 6 illegitimate children, she professed the deepest contrition for the guiltings of her past life and a desire to be admitted to the privileges of the church. And so they were satisfied with the sincerity of her repentance, but on account of the aggravated nature of the case, sent this on to the presbytery, the next higher level in the church government, for being dealt with. You also see things sent up to that next level at the presbytery, usually when there's adultery, and not just 2 single people, but if one of the people involved in the shenanigans was married. Sorry, these are a little hard to read, but this is an interesting one. So Kirk session calls Anne Lunn, the complainer, stated she had no proof that Agnes Reed was a married woman, except common report, several persons having just said it to her that she, the said Agnes Reed, was a married woman. So they asked Agnes Reed, the daughter of Thomas Reed, painter in Jedburgh, and declared that she is an unmarried person. And so this was a dispute where she's saying, I'm not married. And I'm guessing that this was prompted by Agnes wanting to get married, and Anne saying, oops, she's already married. People have told me she's already married. Yeah. And then, it authorizes the clerk to proceed with the proclamation of banns between her and William Lunn. So don't know the relationship here between Anne and William Lunn, but that's what's going on. I'm guessing it maybe the mother doesn't like the potential daughter-in-law. Who knows? Whoops. Sorry. That was the cat. Let's get back to where we were. Come on. Where are we? So there we are. And then this is interesting. This is in the Kirk session records. This is the parish of Traquair, another southern Scotland one. And in the 1830s, not when there was already rumblings about the church split I told you about in 1843, all of the ministers were supposed to do essentially a census in about 1837-38 of all of the male heads of households in their parish. And so that's what this is. So you have William Allen, who he's listed as a heriter and elder. They are the people who'd be the men who'd be on the Kirk session and such. And then the name of the farm he lives in. And then you have John Anderson, who's a shepherd who lives in Glen Valley. Daniel Bald, who's a write or does construction or fabrication work of some sort, who lives in Traquair Mills, and so on. So this is a snapshot of who's in the parish a few years before the 1841 census. This doesn't survive for all of the parishes, but for the ones it does, it's a nice thing to pair with the 1841 census. You get churches that kept track of who took communion. It wasn't a case of everyone was welcome. A lot of what those Kirk session records are is for determining that somebody is worthy of taking communion. So here you see William Little. He's a builder in Denholm. And then you can see the dates he took communion. And some of these will list how someone was admitted, were they a certificate from, a letter of transfer. Here's the one for Leith in the 1830s. And as you can see, it was actually printed. But then you also get annotations. And so this will show people getting married, moving in and out of the parish, dying, going with one of the break-off churches, and so on. And this very nicely, I think this is my Janet Hislop Jameson Chapman here. And so this is 1832. So let's look a little at names. The Scotts were not creative in naming their children. But on the other hand, women until the middle of the 19th century, and actually technically still through today, legally kept their maiden surname. So here's this daughter here, Elizabeth at 13, and the scholar. This is in 1861. 3.5 years later, she gave birth to the first. She didn't have 6 illegitimate children. She only had 4, which is one reason I clipped that other one, is she was not the worst offender at the time period. But you'll notice here we have her father, William Little, her mother, Margaret Gregg, siblings, and then Margaret Cant, her mother-in-law. And so you'll notice here we have Margaret Cant, her daughter, Margaret Gregg, and then her daughter, Margaret Little. How's that for? And so they followed the pattern. The first daughter was named for the maternal grandmother. Sorry, no, they didn't follow. Yet Elizabeth Little, they didn't follow it. They switched the Elizabeth and the Margaret. But these will give you hints as to who is who. But this one census entry, because of this keeping their maiden name, gets us this far just with this census, which is helpful. And then built out, it's like this. Yeah, and this is my great grandmother and her siblings. I don't know if they're full siblings, half siblings. I have not been able to fill that in. So here's the pattern. Father's father, then mother's father, then father for the sons, mother's mother, father's mother, and mother for the daughters. Sometimes, if one of these people further down the list has just died, that may get bumped. They may get bumped up. Sometimes all 3 of these people have the same name. Sometimes you'll get things like if a midwife or doctor saved a baby that didn't look like it was going to make it, they'll name the child for that person. If it's the minister's first baptism in the parish after he takes the pulpit, often the first baby in the parish was named for him. So that's very helpful. So if we go back here with my is my theoretical James Jameson, child of Janet and Robert, the same as the one who married Margaret Guthrie, who later adopted my great-grandfather? If we look at James and Margaret's family, first son is Robert Guthrie Jameson, which is actually after his mother's father. I don't know, but it would also in this case be after the father's father. So that works. The first daughter is Helen Mercer Jameson. Margaret's mother is Helen Mercer. The next son is James Jameson, which works if we assume that both grandfathers were Robert, which is what I'm thinking. And then the third daughter is Margaret after the mother. And you'll notice I skipped Janet, but this slot should be the father's mother. And if this is right, that's exactly who she's named for. Does that make sense to everybody? And it was this with Janet in this slot that caused me to start looking for a Janet Hislop, because I only had the Hislop who married a Jameson, to see if the Thomas Jameson was wrong. So the census, every person starting in 1841. Oh, and this should say latest available. I've changed it elsewhere, but it's 1921 is now available. 1841, adults are generally listed with their age ending in 0 or 5 and rounding down, but this can be off. If someone is 47, says they're 44, they'll be listed as 40. So, and no relationships, and birthplaces, just yes for the county they're being enumerated in, no for elsewhere in Scotland, E for England, and I for Ireland, or F for the whole rest of the world, standing for foreign parts. So let me give you an example. If you remember last week, I pointed out Thomas and Mary McGee Callahan. I wasn't finding them at Scotland's People in 1851. So I flipped to Ancestry, where it's not pay-per-view. They have these index. They don't have the original scans of the originals, but I knew this much. I figured, 1855, they're in Edinburgh, 1840s, mid-1840s, that they're getting married in Dundee. So I figured they're going to be either in Edinburgh or Dundee. And so I looked for a Thomas married to a Mary born about 1815 in Ireland, with the idea that Callahan is a name, as I'm sure you can figure out, gets really butchered. And I did indeed at Ancestry find a Thomas Callahan with a wife, Mary, and a young son. And so what I was able to do is then take this, and I went back to Scotland's People, put Callahan in, and this did not come up in a search for Callahan. But as you see here, that really does say Callahan. So here they are. So that's part of how I use Ancestry to know who to pay for at, often I can narrow it down to a couple families by looking at, now in this case, the son is on the same page, but if his name had been William, I could use these reference numbers. It's the parish and the volume in the page to see that they lived at the same place. Here's 1851 with the Jamesons here with their couple oldest children. Obviously, not the best quality from this, but it's legible. Here in 1861, we have Janet Jameson, born Janet Hislop, later, and she somehow drops the Chapman, but she's using her first husband's surname, and she's living in a little town north of Sterling, acting as the housekeeper for her brother, who's a minister in the Free Church. And so we've got that. 10 years earlier, interestingly, I had his name come up at one of the online forums, and the Dune was on the next line down with his wife, but crossed out. And in the forum, someone was asking what it would be. And it's like, well, it's too short to be domestic. And I said, well, I think it says Dune because 10 years later, he says this. And for any of you trivia fans, if you've watched Outlander or Monty Python, Dune Castle was used as a set for those two things, the TV series and the movie. But again, when you have somebody who is a minister, you get various reference books about them. Here in 1891, we have James and Margaret Jameson again, with grandchildren and a foster daughter. So you can see that. This one, fortunately, his occupation is a little more legible than that other one. Hang on, let me get the cursor in the right place. So this is what I'm ending up with for Peter McGee, later Jameson. And again, interestingly, if you follow the pattern with names, here we have Isabella, named for her mother's mother. James, named for Peter's adoptive father. William Patterson Jameson, named for Charlotte's father. We get Edward John Jameson. And remember, Peter had a brother, Edward. And so because of this and a couple other things, notice one of the other sons was named Francis. I think he probably had some contact with his siblings after he was put into care. And what's interesting, this is my father. And notice Charles Peter Jameson, Charlotte and Peter are his grandparents. So he's named for his father's parents. And then you see John Ralston Jameson is named for Isabella's father. And David Buchanan Jameson, David Buchanan was a brother-in-law of Peter, one of the adopted siblings married, or sisters married to David Buchanan. So even after, moving to the US, my father had a brother, Edward, and then the next brother was David. So, they even in the US, they followed the pattern. This is an interesting one. This is the 1901 census. And down here at the bottom, and let me preface this with, one of the times I gave this talk at a national conference, someone in their comments feedback said it was an excellent presentation, except she had this one really racist example. Well, here it says Zulus, 11 in all. Well, why were there Zulus in Scotland? Well, if you start looking at the rest of the people enumerated in the same household, look at their occupations. We have a tent man, an animal keeper, a menagerie keeper, an elephant keeper, another tent man. So what is this? Well, I went to the newspapers. Savage South Africa, essentially part circus, part exhibition. that was showing then. And they, in the UK, they count everyone where they are the night of the census. Here in the US, we count people at their usual place of residence. But in Scotland, as well as Ireland, England, Wales, and Canada, if you're in a hotel for a night, you get counted in the hotel. There are wills and probate records in the UK, as well as various land transactions that are under various names. But they're much less common than here in the US. So I'm not really going to talk about them because for the most part, the people who were migrating to North America didn't have enough to justify having such records till they got here. So what is available? We've got electoral registers, valuation rolls, tax records. I've shown you some poor law records, post office directories, asylum records, and criminal records. So before 1832, the very few of the electoral registers survive, and they didn't count that big a portion of the population. It was like one man in 125 could vote. Voter reform. The electoral registers are put out annually. It's less information about than the census, but it's every year. So it's kind of like tax lists that way. It's organized by town. Some are at the National Records of Scotland, the National Archive, but a lot are still locally and many haven't been microfilmed. So my understanding is there's beginning to be a project to do that, but I don't know how well it's going. So here's a valuation roll. And here you have the type of building. So this is a house in Albert Place owned by Helen Lunt. And the tenant is Edward J. Arthur, mill worker. So you're going to get a name, address, and occupation. And in this case, these are all, and sometimes you'll then get a subtenant. But they've put these up. So again, it's a snapshot. This is for 1895-96. So it's a snapshot in between the censuses in 1891 and 1901. Scotland's Places has a bunch of tax records from the late 1700s. This is a tax on horses. And this is a tax from the city of Edinburgh on female servants. So if somebody had female servants, they had to pay a tax on employing her. But the nice thing about this is it is something from the 1790s that has the names of ordinary women, not, upper class women and not just men. You actually get the names of the women who were working as servants. Poor law from 1579 to 1844 is handled by church congregations. Changes in 1845. Scotland did have what was both called indoor and outdoor relief. Indoor was having to go live at a poorhouse, workhouse. Outdoor relief was help, a bag of oats, money for rent, firewood. And it was by your parish of birth, or if you've lived somewhere for 7 years. What was kept record-wise varied. The city of Glasgow has incredibly detailed 19th century poor law records. Edinburgh just has those printed records I showed you. Dundee just has a handwritten index with nothing but a name and maybe an indication that the next couple people are children of somebody. So here I showed you this last week, the Edinburgh version. and then children boarded out. The Glasgow ones are not online, last I checked, unfortunately, but you can get copies of them. Post office directories, starting early. This is Edinburgh in 1785. And you can see there are multiple Jamesons here, multiple Williams, only one Robert at this point, but not the one I want. So, and then here in 1820, which is, 1819 is when we have the one sighting of Robert. You'll see here, there's an advocate or, lawyer, professor of natural history, a messenger, a druggist, a baker, a shoemaker. So none of them are at the address my Robert was at, but this is one of my data points in my big spreadsheet, which is this, where I'm trying to trace all of the Roberts and figure out which one is mine. Asylum records. These are not online. Scottish Indexes has an index to them. And for £5, we'll send you a scan of the record. And so this is Margaret Guthrie of Jameson, Peter's adopted mother, and she's laboring under a monomania of unseen agency. And she's later in this, she's convinced that somebody is trying to poison her. She's in the asylum for about a year, gets out, and then they adopt Peter and a little girl named Georgina. So this is not a case where once into the mental institution, she never comes out. This is from the index at the National Records of Scotland. Margaret McGee, Peter's older sister, married Thomas Casey, who ends up in trouble. And again, these are not microfilmed or digitized yet, but I know some people have had luck, either having someone like Scottish Indexes get a copy for them is usually the best way to do it. They have a lot of these ready to go, or they're going in frequently enough. So here's a little more of the detail on one of these. It gives you the court he was tried in, the verdict, the date. This is their, these numbers are essentially call numbers for these records. And so they're what you would want to write down in a citation, because this number will get you back to this particular volume of records. Maps, I'm going to go through this stretch quickly. Amazingly wonderful 19th century maps up at the National Library of Scotland's map webpage. You can see here's a case. This is a town from an 1850s map. Here it is recently on Google Earth or Google Satellite. And you can still see, here's the Y that's here. So really excellent maps. Geograph is a website. The Ordnance Survey divides the all of the UK into quarter-mile grid squares, and Geograph is crowdsourced for finding a trying to get a picture for every one of those grids, and they're doing a pretty good job. And you can see this is the number of pictures for each grid. And when I put in where my great-great-grandmother was born, up in northern Scotland, we get these. And you can see here's Pool, Cottage, now more commonly known as Achnenkloch. And so you can see they were shepherds. It's pretty isolated. And there's a better picture of the house. Well, actually, it's half house and half barn. Can DNA help? Yes. Why DNA didn't do much for me? These are the top matches for my dad. Good Irish Catholic surnames, but not the name I'm looking for. That's McGee. There are right after this a bunch of McGee's. Autosomal, which is what most of us have done. For Francis and Peter, there is a woman descended from an Anne McGee that I'm a DNA match with. She's having things happen in her life in Edinburgh this same time period, having kids in the 1840s to 60s. These other McGees, this is the one where they register the birth the same day. And then Edward and Michael are at the same address as Francis and Helen in 1861. By 1870, Helen has died, but Peter and Francis are at the same address. So this is my sort of, and it's a dotted line because I'm not sure of anything. Any of these could be, aunt, uncle, cousin, niece, nephew, but I'm pretty sure that this is a cluster that all goes together. Partly because if you look here, here's Francis. If Edward's a brother, he names a child for that brother. If Peter is a brother, he names a brother for him. So it seems to me like they may well go together. But the Anne McGee is definitely the woman I'm a match with. Almost all the rest of her family is either Italian or German, and there's just this one line going back to Edinburgh. So I think there's a good chance that that's where the connection is, and it is Anne, especially since Anne and her husband had a child baptized with a sponsor, Francis McGee. And I'm not sure it's this Francis McGee, but again, you're getting how many were there. This is Peter McGee Jameson's wife. And I'm just starting to put this cluster together that you can see how many matches come from each of these people. So she fits in nicely with the ranges. And then here's the one I'm really proud about. This is a cluster with my aunt with 132 and my brother with 37. And there is some overlap. For example, these are the same match. And I've been able to trace a bunch of them back to a couple. Oh, and then this is my new results. And these are the same. They're matching this same cluster. And when I did these at grouping at Ancestry, the one is who they're descended from. And then this little icon is saying that I've got a paper trail on them. And they all go back to this couple married in 1785 in the parish of Cavers. So we've got William Miller and Helen Douglas got married. And 5 of their children lived until 1855 or later, when there's a you get parents' names on death records. And so all 5 of these people list William Miller and Helen Douglas as their parents. And going in the other direction, I'm descended from this William. But these numbers 4 and 2 and 3, sorry, that's the number of generations to my match. But I have 31 people in these clusters where I have a paper trail back to one of these 5 siblings, children of a couple married in 1785. And so, if it's 2 or 3 at this level, you need to do a lot more research. But when you get up to 31 with a paper trail and almost 200 in the overlapping clusters, I'm pretty sure that this couple is the right one. So back to my original question, is James Jameson the son of a Robert Jameson who married a Janet Hislop? And I have come down on the side of yes. I've got this tree built out from Janet Hislop marrying Robert Jameson. And then I have this tree built out from the James Jameson I know of as Peter McGee's adopted father, married to Margaret Guthrie. And yes, these are the same person. Any ideas how I proved this or what I found that clues me in that they are the same person? I know some of you have heard this before, but I've given you lots of hints about what I might be using. That, isn't one particular record saying that James Jameson, who's the son of Robert and Janet, married Margaret Guthrie. But there's something else that can be used to help show a relationship. Well, let me show you. So here's what I'm building out, okay? That James Jameson is their child. Well, what I found is a birth record for this Robert Guthrie Jameson's first child, named Ebenezer Hislop Jameson. So if we go back up to this, Robert Guthrie Jameson and his wife, Margaret Gale, named their first son after Robert's great-grandfather, who was a minister, and therefore probably was prominent enough that, bumped naming the first son for James. Does that make sense? Why I think that, if it was a Robert Guthrie, another Robert Guthrie Jameson, I wouldn't be so sure. If they just named the kid Robert or even Thomas, but because those names are common enough, although Thomas is a little unusual in this time and place. But Ebenezer Hislop is just, it's not William Patterson or Robert Guthrie. It's a pretty unusual name. So that's how I have pretty much said, okay, I'm done. I've made this connection. My great-grandfather, Peter McGee, really was bad with names. And when James Jameson died in the 1890s and Peter McGee had to pull a name out for his father, instead of pulling Robert's name, who died well before, I know that Robert died before 1846 because that's when Janet married Gavin Chapman. But Thomas Hislop didn't die until Peter was about 9 years old. So older relative on his dad's side of the family, Thomas. So, what I found when Peter's wrong is that he tends to not completely mess up a name. So, for example, when he got married, instead of putting Helen Cassidy or Eleanor Cassidy or Ellen Cassidy, he put Helen Norrie. And so I'm guessing that she may have actually been Eleanor or Ellen and was called Norrie, Eleanor Norrie. And that's what he pulled. And then there's another case where he mixes up 2 siblings as well. So I think that this is a case that works. So with that, I'm going to stop that screen sharing. And any questions at this point? So I wanted to show a few more records that were before, that go into the 18th century. It's tough, but it can be worked on. And you might get lucky and have a DNA cluster like that. Okay, I'm going to stop the recording.